So today's topic is how to answer the most popular anti-Israel slurs. If you thought I was going to be speaking about Hasbara 2.0 like I did 2 years ago, I'm not, but the talk is online. There's actually video on YouTube. It was like an hour and 40 minutes. I have a feeling tonight might be about as long. At the end, I'm going to be doing the Hasby Awards. For those of you that really care about these sort of things, the fake awards that I made up, people took it very seriously last time, but I'm going to be doing it after the talk. First thing to think about is you have to know when it's worth arguing. You have to, when I say how to answer the anti-Israel arguments, you have to understand that usually you don't even want to get into these arguments. Usually the people that you're arguing against are the ones that are already so anti-Zionist and you're not going to be convincing them of anything. Hasbara, which again I spoke to about last time, Hasbara is rarely about arguments and winning arguments. Jews like to argue. Jews think that they're very good at winning arguments, and we are. But that's usually not what changes people's hearts and minds. And again, you can listen to my last talk about that. But I just want to, it's still important for you to know how to answer these things. And sometimes the way you answer can also be very effective. But I just want you to understand, don't think that this is the way of doing Hasbara, of doing Israeli advocacy. It's a component, but there are lots of other components that are probably far more important than this. But this is also very important, and I think that you're going to learn a lot. When you are arguing online, on Twitter, in message boards or something like that, keep in mind what the audience is. As I said, you're not going to be changing the mind of the person you're arguing against. Very, very rarely are you going to have somebody that's honest enough to say, well, yeah, you know what, you're right, you have a point. That's never going to happen, or hardly ever going to happen. But you think about who's watching it, who's reading these Twitter exchanges, who's on the message board, and what the best place to of doing these sort of things is. Twitter has the other advantage that people have egos, most people do at least, and so reporters are on Twitter, but if you have a good point that you make to them, they'll answer you back. You know, they don't care that you're nobody. If you have a good point, they'll generally answer. And politicians sometimes too, actors, they all, you know, sometimes you can get into a conversation. Sometimes these conversations can make news. Sometimes you can really, you know, you can get a person's opinion to, I mean, it's nice to have that back and forth. So it's a really, really great tool in order to be able to do this sort of thing. I like Amazon message boards for long term only because the people that are on there are usually smarter than most people because they actually read. But it's not a huge, you know, venue, absolutely. But you know, don't bother wasting time arguing with people on YouTube message boards. Those are the dumbest people on the planet. So sometimes you do want to engage your opponent, and sometimes you want to ridicule him. There's a reason that the Haggadah says Hakei Shinov. You know, when you're dealing with a Russia, it makes a lot more sense. When you're dealing with somebody evil, it makes a lot more sense to ridicule them, to make fun of them, to point out their hypocrisy. We're going to be discussing some of those examples tonight. But and also you have to understand, you have to be brief. Then that's the thing. Also, again, you have to get yourself out of the mindset of we're arguing a piece of Gemara. You know, it's not what it is. Your argument has to be made quickly, it has to be made effectively, and it has to be made a point. Sometimes you have to use sarcasm, sometimes you have to use jokes, but it's not and there's so much of a desire to let me explain everything to you, and which is in fact what I'm going to be guilty of tonight doing. But the fact is, when you actually get into these engagements, you have to keep in mind, you know, don't lose your audience. You have to know what you're saying and be as brief but as clear as possible. And also, even if you think you're preaching to the choir and you don't think you're convincing the other side, that's valuable too. Because that's really a lot of what I do when it comes down to it. I mean, sometimes people, you know, go to my blog from the other side. Of course I do. A lot of people come from all over the place. But the fact that I exist and people go to there and they go, oh, wow, you know, I didn't think of that. That's great. You know, I'm glad. I mean, it just happened last night. Again, I shouldn't go into too many tangents, but Haaretz yesterday published an article that said that we have proof that Israel just admitted that they are injecting we're injecting Ethiopian women without their knowledge with contraceptives. And it was based on an earlier story that was a TV show like 6 weeks ago. But there was a memo that the Israeli Health Ministry came out with a memo after the other TV show came out, and the memo said, hey, everybody be careful, make sure that when you do this sort of thing that you have full consent. Haaretz took that memo and said, they're admitting that they gave it without their consent, which is not what the memo said at all. And so I looked at it, and I saw this big mistake, and then I came up and I actually explained in a completely different way than Haaretz did, and later found out my way was definitely right, how the story, is wrong. But in the meanwhile, all the anti-Semites in the world now have ammunition for the next 50 years saying, how racist Israelis are against Ethiopians. So it's important sometimes, whether the story's already out there. I'm not sure how much impact I'm having, but it's important to at least to have our side know that, hey, we're not wrong. First argument. Israel is a colonialist state. Joseph Massad of Columbia loves this sort of thing. I once saw an article he wrote. He used the word colonialist like 50 times, but he never defined what colonialism was. So, okay, look in the dictionary. You can find out what colonialism. Look in an encyclopedia. Colonialism, by definition, requires what's called a metropole. It has a father country, a mother country, and what the British did to India, what the French did to Algeria. That's what colonialism is. It's based. There is a major country over there. Israel, and the Arabs would say, they were saying this even before 67. The Arabs would be saying, oh, Israel's a colonialist state because it was set up by the Western powers. Now, maybe they can make a point saying that it feels like a colonialist state to them, but by definition, not only is it not colonialist, it's anti-colonialist because Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. It is a movement of self-determination. It's as liberal as things get. This is and as anti-colonialist as things get, because the Jews are the indigenous people of the Middle East, of Israel and of the area. So it's not colonialism, it's anti-colonialism. This is how you have to answer them. That's the point. Plus, you're doing it in liberal terms, because they're trying to give you an argument, say, oh, you're colonialist is evil, they're coming from a liberal perspective. You're saying, no, Israel is more liberal than what you're saying, because it's actually anti-colonialist. Some people say, oh, now they've modified the argument. They're saying, oh, the settlements are colonialist. Israel is the metropole and the settlements are the colonies. But again, the fact is, it's not that Israel set up the settlements. They didn't discourage them. But the fact is, people are voluntarily moving. So it's still not the same sort of thing. And it's historic Jewish homeland when it comes down to it. Where they're moving is still their historic Jewish homeland. It is not colonialism. But it's very important, and again, this is an important aside, that the framework is critical. There was a very well-meaning liberal Jews and Arabs in Israel got together a couple of years ago and they said, we're going to come up with a textbook, a history textbook that shows both sides of the story, both narratives. And it's literally a textbook they put it. It's halfway down the middle of it's two columns. One shows the Arab way of looking at things and one shows the Israeli way of looking at things. And they're saying this is fair. We're being as fair as possible. We're showing two different narratives. The year that this history book started was 1917, was the Balfour Declaration. That's wrong. From a Jewish perspective, from the Zionist perspective, history doesn't begin in 1917. History doesn't begin with the first Aliyah. It doesn't begin in the 1800s. It begins with Moshe. It begins with Yoshua. It begins thousands of years ago. If you start history in 1917, you've already lost the argument. Because in 1917, the Jews were outsiders. They were the ones that were coming in. They're not returning anything because history begins in 1917. You can't do that. If you already accept that argument, you lose. So the framework is critical. And that's part of the framework with this colonialist argument. If history begins in 1917, sure, the Jews look like colonialists. But history doesn't begin in 1917. History begins at zero. And the Jews were there first. And so don't say that the Jews moved, they immigrated or something like that. They returned. Number two, Israel's taking up 78% of historic Palestine. I love Mahmoud Abbas says this, Saib Erekat, they always love saying historic Palestine. We've already given up 78% of our historic Palestine. History, it sounds like it's so historic, it's so long ago. Palestine's been there for so long. What is historic Palestine? Well, if you look at any map of Palestine that the PLO comes up with or that Fatah comes up with, any of these things, you see that it's the boundaries of the British Mandate that were created in 1922. So their historic Palestine map began in 1922. That's not very historic. 90 years ago is not that that big a sense of history they have. For people that have been there from time immemorial, that's not very historic. Now, this is a map. I don't remember where this one came from. I think this might be from Encyclopedia Britannica, 1911, showing this is Palestine. This is what Palestine looks like today, in 1911. And you see there's part of it that is in Jordan, and the Negev isn't included in there. And it's just it doesn't look like today's map of Israel. This is what Palestine was 100 years ago. If you ask people what Palestine, if you asked a geographer, what was Palestine 100 years ago, this is what it looked like. So how come, and we'll talk about it in the next slide, but it's weird that what they're calling historic Palestine, there's no history behind it. It's Western powers. They hated Westerners, and they were colonialists. The British were obviously colonialists. They hated Western colonialists, drew an arbitrary map, and that is all of a sudden the sacred boundaries of historic Palestine. There's a little bit of an irony over there. And I only did this last night. I didn't even think of this before. But if you looked at the actual square miles of what this historic Palestine was, the west of the Green Line is about 4,000 square miles. The West Bank itself is about 3,000. And the part that's in Transjordan, or at Transjordan at the time, Jordan today, it was 4,000. So if you figure it out, Israel is taking up about 35% of real historic Palestine. Jordan is taking up about 35% of real historic Palestine. And the West Bank, however you want to define it, is the remaining 30% or so. Nobody says this. Nobody realizes it. But if you want to talk about it, if you're going to use the term historic Palestine, let's use the word historic Palestine. Let's see what it really means. But this brings up lots of new questions. Why aren't the Palestinians today claiming Eastern Palestine? This is a fundamental question. They say they want their land back. They're they'll go on TV, they're going to have books and movies and everything, talking about it, getting people to cry about all these people that are missing their land. There's this whole land called Eastern Palestine on the other side of the Jordan. They don't talk about that. They never want that. They're not asking for that. Why isn't? Why are they originally throwing away what really is historic Palestine, or a part of what historic Palestine is? In 1964, the PLO Charter explicitly excluded the West Bank and Gaza from their definition of Palestine. Really, if you look it up in the Charter, they say we have no claims whatsoever on the West Bank, Gaza, and a couple other little territories that were not controlled by the Jews. In other words, if you look at the Palestinian history, the land that they want was always the land controlled by the Jews. Once if it's not controlled by the Jews, they're no longer interested. This is a fundamental thing to understand. Why are they accepting the boundaries drawn by the hated colonialists of the Western? But again, why are their claims always congruent with what the Jews control? Do they want a state, or do they want to destroy a state? I think we know the answer to that. But this is proof positive that this is what their motivation is. Because they're not saying, hey, we were historically in Amman, Jordan. We were historically in all these other places. They're not talking about that. And, except for a tiny bit in 1970 when Yasser Arafat tried to take over Jordan, there has never been talk about, the Palestinians taking up Jordan. Now you could also go down the argument, Jordan is Palestine, people go in that direction, fine. But the fact is, when you hear the words historic Palestine, all of these things should be popping into your mind. It's just a huge, huge hypocrisy going on over there. Number 3, Zionists always intended to ethnically cleanse Arabs. Very often you will see, if you look in the history there, the pro-Palestinian side, which is really the anti-Israel side, is going to find quotes from Ben-Gurion, from Weizmann, from whoever, from famous Zionists, and they'll twist them, from Herzl too, and they'll twist these comments into saying, they always wanted to get rid of the Arabs. They always said they were going to do this, X, Y, and Z. Jabotinsky, everybody, they were going to be saying that. Almost invariably, practically invariably, if you actually look up the quotes, and people have done it, I think Camera Honest Reporting has actually spent the time actually going through all of these fake quotes. You look through them and you'll see that they were saying the exact opposite. But it does take a long time to research. But finding counterexamples is really easy. One of the things I haven't done so much lately, but I used to really enjoy doing, the Palestine Post, which is what the Jerusalem Post used to be called, is online for the years 1928 until 1950. So you can actually look at it online and see, and read the articles. And you get a sense, when you read contemporaneous newspaper articles, you get a sense of how people were actually thinking. Now, okay, the Palestine Post was reflecting more the labor-type government. It wasn't the revisionist. Okay, I understand all that. But it still was the mainstream, Zionist way of thinking. It certainly reflected that. Never are you going to see an editorial in the Palestine Post saying, we got to get rid of the Arabs. And I'm talking about before 48. You're never going to see anything like that. They never said anything close to that. They were saying, they knew we're going to have a state. We definitely want a state. But consistently they'll say, Arabs are going to be part of our state. They're going to be equal citizens. And again, Ben-Gurion said that as well. Everybody said it. In Haifa, the Haganah explicitly tried to stop the Arabs from leaving. They were like saying, please, you don't have to go. And the Arabs left anyway. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more later. And beyond that, if Israel wanted to ethnically cleanse the Arabs, they're really doing a lousy job, because there are more Arabs in Israel than there ever have been before. So every time they talk about ethnic cleansing and talking about genocide and this and that, it's like, Israel's army's pretty good, and if they really wanted to kill these guys, I think they could have done it by now. It's been 60 years. They're really doing a lousy job if they're trying to get rid of all the Arabs, whether it's shipping them out in trucks or killing them. But, okay. If you do want to talk about ethnic cleansing, so again, here's a chance where when you hear the argument to be able to turn it around to the other people, how many Jews remained in the West Bank from 49 to 67? The answer is literally 0. Jordan kicked out every single Jew, whether it was from the part of Jerusalem that they controlled or the rest of the West Bank, obviously Gush Etzion, everything. There's 0 Jews were left. I think that's the definition of ethnic cleansing. How many Jews are left in Syria, Egypt, Yemen, etc.? It's very, very few, if any. That's what ethnic cleansing is. So if you're going to talk about the Jews, ethnically cleansing the Palestinians, let's at least get our definitions right. Number 4, and this is going to actually be a series because this is important, but it's going to get detailed, but I apologize. Israel expelled 700,000 Arabs, made them refugees in the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. Let's go through history. Let's see what really happened. And again, usually I will try to look at, again, the Palestine Post is easy but it's the easiest way for me to do it. I will try to look at primary sources. Because history books are skewed. Whatever you read nowadays, from contemporary people is going to be skewed. It's much, much nicer to be able to go as much back. So even though the New York Times at the time might have been skewed, they didn't have the agendas. So you could read the New York Times, Time Magazine, go through Google News archives and see old news articles. It's really, really good to see how people thought at the time. The important thing to think, in 1936, the Arabs of Palestine, nobody called them Palestinians at the time, the Arabs of Palestine started a revolt. A very bloody revolt. They ended up losing more of their own people. They ended up killing thousands of their own people during this revolt because, as very often happens, when Palestinian Arabs fight, they start, when they don't succeed, they start going against each other and saying, you're a collaborator, we're going to have to kill you. These sort of things happen. So many, many thousands ended up dying. But hundreds of Jews died as well, British. It was a mess. But while that was happening, a significant number of upper-class Palestinian Arabs moved to Lebanon. They just said, I don't want to deal with this. This is not for me. We're going out. We're getting out of here. This is not for us. Then came 1947, partition. Within hours of the partition vote, November 30th, 1947, they started fighting. The first bomb to a bus was literally within hours that the Arabs, did against the Jews. It was clear that was going to be fighting again. Immediately, December 1947, thousands and tens of thousands of the upper class, the richer Palestinians, all started packing out again to go to Lebanon because they thought, we'll do the same thing, wait it out, we'll come back. That's what we've done for years. Arabs are, they move. That's what, they don't have a problem moving from one place. To them, the entire Arab world was not divided into states. And it wasn't divided into states you have to understand, before the Ottoman Empire ended in 1918, for them it was all one big country. So just because the Western powers decided to draw lines, they didn't think the lines meant anything. So they go from one place to another. It was still Arabia to them. They didn't care. Go to Lebanon, go to Syria, whatever. And that's how many of them, of course, moved into Palestine at the same time. Many of them, when the economy became good after the Jews were improving the economy, especially in the 20s and 30s, thousands and some tens, hundreds of thousands, literally, I think it's about 200,000 Arabs is my best guess, actually moved into Palestine because of how great it was economically. They didn't have a problem moving from one place to another. There was no state borders. They didn't have to worry about this sort of thing. So again, 1947, they start packing off to Lebanon. Out of those 700,000, about, I don't remember the exact number, sorry, but it's 200, 300,000 or more actually left before May 1948. They left on their own. Most of them they didn't see any fighting. There was now obviously there was some fighting. There was, I'm not saying that it was 100%, but most fled. When it came down to it, most of them fled. I mean, you could say, like Jews like to say, the Zionists like to say, and it's not as accurate either. The Zionists like to say, they were told to leave. The leaders told them they had to go. Some of them did. There was some of that, but that wasn't the majority. There were, were there massacres? you read Betty Morris, it's hard for you to say that there weren't zero massacres. There were a couple. There were things that happened. But most of them did not see, any Haganah or any Irgun fighters. They fled ahead of time. They were afraid, and which is reasonable. A war is coming. You're afraid. You run away. Look what's happening in Syria right now. There's 700,000 refugees in Syria as of today, according to the UNHRC, and that's only the ones that they're counting. It's probably more. So they left. There were also fear of fighting. There was fear of revenge for the 1929 massacres. Only 18 years before that, where the pogroms in Hebron and in Tiberia. And they were afraid. Hey, if the Jews are getting the upper hand, they might want to take revenge on us because that's what we would do. So we're leaving. But the main part was fear. Most of them just said, we're scared. Plus, they saw that the rich ones and their leaders were leaving, and that gave them even less of a chance of wanting to stick around. So a lot of them left. Jews were afraid too. It was a war. The Jews were afraid too. But the Jews had nowhere to go. They had the choice of going to the sea or fighting, staying and fighting for their land. The Arabs that lived there were saying, we have this whole large amount of area that we can go to, and our Arab brethren are going to let us in because that's what they've done all the time. We never had a problem moving from one place to another. That is how all those refugees came about, in as short a way as I can say it. Going into the next part. It says, Israel created and is responsible for the refugee problem. Okay, let's go. Let's further on what happened. So all these refugees went to Lebanon, to Egypt, to Jordan. And with the exception of Jordan had its own plans for what to do with the Middle East. But every other Arab country refused to let them become citizens. Israel, understandably, did not want a fifth column to come back. To say, sure, we'll let our Arabs back. They saw how they were fighting. They saw how some of them did join in with the invading Arab armies. Israel was not thrilled, and Israel always felt, and we're going to say this later, but Israel always felt that they wanted to have a comprehensive peace, and the refugees should just be part of that. They didn't want to give up the whole refugee card. Israel was saying, we want a full peace treaty with the Arabs. We want to have the final border set. We want a peace treaty. We want to have no more war. Refugees will be part of that solution. But Israel always wanted a comprehensive peace, which is in fact what the UN at the time was used to say. But in the meanwhile, the Arabs started treating them really badly, treating the Palestinian refugees awfully, and they still do. They would not let them become citizens. There's a law in the Arab League, and this is not a joke. Every Arab state, according to the Arab League, that follow this law, say that you are supposed to allow any other Arab citizen to become any other Arab to become a citizen of your country, except for Palestinians. We must keep them stateless, because that way they're not saying this explicitly, but we must keep them stateless in order for them to be pawns to be used against Israel. That's what they do, and it happens today. If you read their stuff, they say it today. It's amazing. Okay, the other two things are what we can talk about later. I see I'm going to go way over. But the refugees themselves have no say in what they're going to do. There have been a couple of cases in Lebanon and recently in Egypt where there have been a chance for a certain small percentage of these people, descendants of refugees, these Palestinians, to become citizens of the country. Egypt did it recently, in which they passed a law and they said, not only your father has to be Egyptian in order to become an Egyptian citizen, but your mother can be also. And it took a few years, but they finally, after the revolution, the Egyptian Supreme Court said, okay, we're going to start enforcing this. And immediately, thousands of Palestinian Arabs who had Egyptian mothers immediately ran to become citizens of Egypt. So all the argument they say, they don't want to become citizens. They really want to maintain their own state. It's all garbage. As soon as they can. Lebanon also, about 50,000 over the years, Lebanon has allowed about 50,000 to become citizens. Number 6. United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194 demands that the refugees have the right to return. There is a resolution called 194. That's about all that's true. In the resolution, it says, it doesn't use the word right. United Nations General Assembly resolutions do not have force of international law. Their resolutions are pretty much a dime a dozen. They're really worthless as far as legally are concerned. But when it was being drafted, it deliberately did not use it. Actually, Great Britain wanted to use the word right. They took it out. The word right is certainly not used. What it does say is that in one of the paragraphs, or about 16 paragraphs in the resolution, one of the paragraphs, the only one anybody talks about nowadays, says, refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. And actually, the sentence right after that also talks about compensation for the ones that don't want to. Israel was always interpreting the "and live at peace with their neighbors" as being the part saying, these guys don't want to live at peace with us. That's, so therefore we are not obligated to take these people back. But nevertheless, it's not law. There's nothing that forces it to happen. The UN Conciliation, and I found this, and I don't know why nobody knows this. This is amazing to me. I found this on a UN site. The UN Conciliation Commission was created by the same resolution, Resolution 194. They created this thing called UN Conciliation Commission, tried to come up with a solution for what to happen with the refugees. And by the way, if you look at the resolution, it doesn't only say Arab refugees. It also deals with Jewish refugees. It does not specify. But when they looked at it, they actually did a whole legal analysis and tried to determine what the word means, and they determined that the word homes said, to return to their homes, they said that means literally their houses. And they said explicitly, if the house doesn't exist, we're not talking homeland. We're not saying they have a right to return to their homeland. We have a right to return to the building they used to live in. If that building isn't there, then they should be compensated. The UN said this in 1950. Nobody remembers this. But this is how the UN interpreted this. And they said, and for otherwise, you should compensate. That's what it should be. So, why didn't and why doesn't Israel allow the Arabs to return nowadays? And I briefly talked about this already. But Israel always wanted to be part of a comprehensive solution, which was the major goal of the Conciliation Commission as well. They definitely had fear of a fifth column. And I've quoted it a number of times in my blog, and it's worth looking up if you just want to do a search on my blog. Dorothy Baradone wrote, she lived near this Arab village called Zerin. And she describes very lyrically, she loved, she was good friends with the Arabs in this village. They would go to each other's, weddings. They would do it. They would feed each other. They had to, she remembers them, and she remembers them all specifically. When the Iraqi army came to the village, she was hearing her friends yelling and screaming, "Kill the Jews." And she was astonished at this, but afterwards, and then of course, luckily, and they were sniping, and they, during the war, the kids were, they were being sniped at, walking in the fields. There would be snipers. And afterwards, and the Haganah won that part. They beat them, and the people all ran away. And she's saying, "Sorry, I feel bad for you. I don't like the fact that you're living under an olive tree right now, but better you than me. You're the ones that are trying to kill us. I'm not letting you back very so soon." And that's really what it comes down to. You have to, it's so easy to say, return, no, it's a right, it's this and that. But there's human beings over here. You have to understand how it really comes down to it. Okay. Number 7. More Palestinian refugees than any other refugee group. Right now, supposedly there are 5 million Palestinian refugees, and there are about 3 million Afghan, 1.6 million Iraqi, et cetera, et cetera. So many more. We're talking apples and oranges. The definition of a refugee, of a Palestinian refugee, is not decided by the UN High Commissioner of Refugees. It was decided by UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Organization, or I can't even think, sorry. The organization that was set up by the UN specifically for Palestinian refugees before actually UNHCR was set up, before the High Commission of Refugees was set up. So they have a different definition. In fact, the UN definition of refugees hadn't been written yet, so they pretty much were flying by the seat of their pants. They come up with their own definition of refugees. But that definition has gotten worse over the years because UNRWA doesn't have a mechanism for people to leave the category of refugees. In other words, if you're a citizen of a country, you're clearly not a refugee. There are 2 million Jordanian Palestinians, something like that are citizens. But UNRWA calls them refugees. If you're living in your homeland, you're clearly not a refugee. Maybe you're a displaced person, but you're not a refugee. But the people that are living in the West Bank and Gaza are still in refugee camps. How can they be considered refugees when they're living in their own country? It doesn't make sense. So UNRWA plus, and even worse, UNRWA counts the descendants of the refugees forever. So there is never going to be fewer refugees than there are today. And in 10 years, there's never going to be fewer refugees than there are in 10 years. Because UNRWA has no mechanism to get rid of that. And nobody worries about this. Everybody says, "Oh, UNRWA, we're going to need to give them more funding. We have to, and every year there's a big fight, and UNRWA complains, where our budgets are down there." Their budget's going to keep going down the drain because there might be 5 million now. There's going to be 6 million in 5 years. There's going to be 7 million in 10 years. That's, it's never going to end. There's no mechanism to solve the problem. UNRWA just says the only way to solve the problem is to have a peace agreement in which Israel accepts, a certain number of refugees, and the Arabs agree to it. And the Arabs aren't going to agree to it. So, there's other differences between the UNHCR and UNRWA. UNHCR actually tries to resettle refugees. UNRWA doesn't. Also, 98% of the UNRWA staff is Arab itself, so it itself is a political organization right now. But you cannot call the people that are Palestinian refugees today to be true refugees. I tried to count it myself. I'm sure it's far less than 100,000 nowadays of people that are actual refugees, meaning that they actually left out of fear or were kicked out or whatever, that are alive nowadays. And probably less, because only 700,000 were done then, and they were 65 years later. By the way, Israel resettled its Arab refugees. UNRWA wanted to work in Israel too. UNRWA wanted to set up camps in Israel. They're saying, hey, you have Arab refugees, we'll help you. We're helping the Arab countries, we'll help you. Israel, and again, this is in the UNRWA records, said, this is repugnant to us. These people are members of our state, these Arabs are our citizens, we're not going to have outside people running camps for them. We're going to resettle them. Yes? There were refugees that were, you would call them displaced persons nowadays, but there are people that lost their homes. But they still ended up in Israel. When the war was ended, they still were in Israel, but they weren't in their homes, and their villages were destroyed or whatever. What?
They're from the West Bank?
No, they were within the boundaries of Israel as well. Just they didn't have any place to go, but they were still under the definition of refugee because in those days the definition of refugee was not as precise. But they would have fallen under UNRWA, and these are the only people that ever fell off the UNRWA rolls in history are the ones that were in Israel. Plus the Jews that were in Israel, because UNRWA it originally did also count to like 16,000 Jewish refugees, but in Israel assimilated them and said, hey, you don't have to worry about them anymore, and UNRWA said, okay, fine. But since then, they remained refugees. But the word repugnant was amazing. Argument number 8. Does this look familiar to anybody? This is all over the place. They love, the anti-Israel crowd loves this map, and this is the same map that was shown on Metro North. This guy that paid for these ads. It shows the disappearing Palestine. On the left, supposedly it shows Palestinian land is in green, Jewish land is in white, and it shows how it's changed over the years. This map is, of course, a lie. I call it the map that lies. I probably should have kept a copy of it over here for you to see. But the first picture, let me see if I can go back. The first picture shows the white part is privately owned Jewish land. The green part is privately owned Arab land, publicly owned land by the British, and parts that are leased, because there's actually 4 different land categories that were being used by the Ottoman Empire beforehand, that of only one tiny part of it was actually private land. So they're comparing, again, apples and oranges. If you compare that to the amount of privately owned Arab land, which would be proper, yes, there was more privately owned Arab land at the time, but it was maybe twice as much. Most of it, vast majority, was state land. Second map is, great, it's the partition plan. What does that have to do with anything? It was never implemented, it never happened to anything. It has nothing to do with ownership of land. It just was a plan that the Arabs rejected. Number 3, fine, that's a very nice picture of what Israel looked like before 1967. But again, we're not talking private ownership of land over here. We're talking, Israel properly took over what the British public lands were, because that's what a state does. You take over the previously public lands. And of course, the fourth map is the showing what they call their Bantustans.
What happens in the corner of Gaza environment?
What happens to the? What do you mean?
In
That is weird. I don't know what they mean by that. Oh, that was because that was before that white part. They're talking about Jewish settlements. They're trying to put the Jewish settlements there. That's what they're trying to say. So okay, I didn't even notice that. So whoops, go back. So the 67 map, so again, the West Bank was Jordanian. It was not Palestinian land. That's the other thing. It was Jordanian land. Gaza was Egyptian land. Nobody called the land Palestinian, so that has nothing to do with anything. And there were public lands there as well. And also, there are Arabs that own land in Israel, but that doesn't show that in the other picture. So the map is good. It's a wonderful piece of propaganda, but it has zero truth to it. In response, I once decided to make my own map. Here's what Israel's land concessions were since from 1967. Here's the areas controlled by Israel in 67 in the first map. The areas controlled in 93 in the second map. There's a little bit new on top because they did control part of Lebanon, but southern Lebanon at that time. And now the amount that Israel controls, directly. So I'm excluding obviously the PA self-ruled areas. So here's another set of maps. Which is more accurate? I think mine's more accurate. And this is all done specifically to pursue peace. That's the whole thing. Israel, every single time Israel gives up land, it's for peace. The entire Sinai, which was 90% of the territories. You know, when the UN says Israel has to give back territories, this is 90% was given back. Southern Lebanon, of course, Gaza, and also the PA controls much of Judea and Samaria. And besides that, as we all know, Israel has accepted a two-state solution, which they didn't used to do. They've recognized a terror group. They've offered even to share Jerusalem, which is, again, in my opinion, ridiculous. And they've even negotiated the Golan with Syria. So Israel has definitely tried to have peace. So when you see the map and you see the reality, it's just there's nothing in common between them. Number 9, Israel was the aggressor in 1967. And the reason they say that is because Israel fired the first shot in 1967. As far as that goes, that's as true as it goes. But what really happened? The Arab nations, this is a cartoon from a May 1967 newspaper in Beirut, this is Lebanon, showing how the Arabs were expecting the war to happen. This is the incitement, and I have a whole bunch of these actually. This is the incitement that was being shown on not just Arab newspapers, Arab radio, TV, everything, talking about how they were going to finally destroy the Jews. Then in Egypt, again, if you know the history, Egypt expelled the UN troops. There were UN troops in the Sinai after the 1956 war, and Egypt expelled them. And they said, we don't want you in the way because we're going to want to, overrun Israel. And then finally, Israel told everybody, said, even with all of this incitement, Israel told the world and let everybody know, through diplomatic channels, that it would not initiate any hostilities as long as Egypt still kept open the Straits of Tiran, which was an important shipping lane for Israel. But Egypt did close them, which is called a casus belli, an actual reason, legal reason that one is allowed to go to war. It's true Israel fired the first shot. Here's another cartoon, by the way. But it's true Israel fired the first shot. But Israel, destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. We all know that. Fine. But Israel didn't start the Assyrian front in the war. Israel didn't start the Jordanian front in the war. Both of those fronts were started by the other side, which means that all of the land in the West Bank, all the land of the Golan, were gained in a clearly defensive war. Now, whether that's legally allowed or not, that whether you can gain land in defensive war is not a simple thing to say, but is clearly the land that Israel now has, that it gained in 1967, it got in a defensive war. The only thing you can argue about it, the Sinai is gone. Okay. Number 10. Israel must return to its internationally recognized borders, meaning the Green Line of 1967. The problem is Israel never had internationally recognized borders. It never existed. The Green Line was not recognized by anybody, not by the Arabs, not by Israel. It was always meant to be a temporary armistice line until a final peace agreement was made. If you read the Israel-Jordan armistice agreement, it says explicitly the demarcation lines defined in this thing are agreed to without prejudice to future territorial settlements or boundary lines or claims. This is not a boundary. It's not a state boundary. People talk about it nowadays as if it is. People say Israel has to go back to the 67 lines. The 67 lines didn't exist. There were 1949 armistice lines. They were not borders. They were always meant to be part of a comprehensive peace agreement. And even if you look at the famous United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, they say, Israel and her neighbors have the right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force, which means that the existing boundaries were not secure nor recognized. 11a. Israel illegally occupies the territories. This is going to get slightly boring. I have to get into legal stuff over here. I apologize, but it's important for you to at least know the answers, and then we can talk about how to actually answer it when people bring it up, because the true answers are a bit too boring. But first, the background. What's the definition of occupation? The Geneva Accords that everybody quotes is not the definition of occupation. They do not define occupation. The only place in international law that occupation is defined is the Hague Convention of 1907. That is the definition. When it's actually placed under the authority of the hostile army, occupation extends only to the territory where such authority has been established and can be exercised. Okay? The Hague Conventions only talks about high state parties, high contracting parties talking to each other. It doesn't talk about stateless land, by the way. So the first answer, and one that's very popular with right-wingers in Israel, but I don't see any holes in it, is that the land isn't occupied at all, but it's disputed. It had no recognized sovereign before 1967, because Jordan's annexation of the West Bank was recognized by practically nobody in the world. Although, believe it or not, it looks like the United States might have sort of passively done it, but practically nobody. The Hague definition, like I said, only applies to parties of the convention. when it comes down to it, Israel has the best legal claim to Judea and Samaria because the only thing that was legally important that happened to that area was determined during the British Mandate period of the San Remo Conference, in which it says, and which what they wrote is the mandatory shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative, and economic conditions as will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home. This was the entirety of what's now called Palestine. This is going up until the Jordan border, the Jordan River. That League of Nations, League of Nations approved the San Remo Conference. It remains legal under the UN. According to the UN own laws, anything that happened before that was done by the League of Nations remains in effect. So, according to this line of argument, the best claim is the Jewish claim. The best legal claim to Judea and Samaria is the Jewish claim. In fact, the only valid claim, according to these people. It's not even a dispute. These people say it's clearly Jewish land. There's nothing that said otherwise. Yes? That's part of the text. I don't remember whether it's in San Remo or the British definition, but it was. I'd have to look it up. Sorry, I don't have it again on me. But okay. Second answer. I just found this last week. In fact, it was written up in the Voloch conspiracy today in the blog. But I found this law book. This person once told me this international legal scholar once, I heard him talk, and he said, if you want to figure out what the laws of occupation are without being biased by today's political realities, look at how people define the law before 1967. Because nowadays everybody wants to be anti-Israel, but see how they said it before 67. And I just happened last week to find this book and this guy Hans Kelsen is actually a well-known legal theorist. And he wrote that if it essentially said if it's not under sovereignty, the rules of occupation don't exist. The Geneva rules of occupation don't exist if the land had no previous sovereign. The fact is, Israel has voluntarily enforced the Geneva Convention, the humanitarian or the human rights portions of the Geneva Conventions, but it never accepted the idea that they were legally occupied. A third point, not quite an answer, but it's a point, is the whole wording of illegal occupation is problematic. Occupation is just a thing. Either a country is occupied by another country or not, or a territory is occupied by another country or not. There's nothing legal or illegal about it. There's no judgmental part about occupation. The U.S. was occupying Iraq for a few years in the in the early 2000s. Was that legal? Was that illegal? There's nothing to do with any. Legality is not an issue. The question is, was it occupied? Did it fit the Hague definition of occupation? When people use the word illegal occupation, they're just knowingly adding an inflammatory phrase that just has no purpose. It's a rhetorical device, but it's not a legal argument. I did see one paper, and I just put it as a footnote over here. This I guess an Israeli lawyer tried to find a definition. I was reading her thing, and it really made no sense, because essentially she just said, well, if the UN defines it as illegal, then it must be illegal, so therefore now I'm going to have to try to come up with a consistent definition of what legal and illegal are, based on the UN. But it made no sense, because obviously the UN is doing it from a political point of view, and there was no consistency. A fourth point is, even if you would accept occupation, clearly, Gaza and Area A, if you know what Area A is, I hope you do, but clearly Gaza and Area A are not occupied by any definition. If you look at what the Hague definition is, even if you look more recently at what the definitions of occupation for that were written by the Red Cross, by Amnesty International, had a really great definition that they came out with before the U.S. occupied Iraq. But anyway, you look at it, if you cannot, if the supposed occupying country can't get rid of the head of, the judges, or get rid of the politicians, or get rid of the garbage men that are under occupation, then they're not occupying them. If they don't have the power to get rid of the garbage men, then they're not an occupying power. So Gaza clearly is not occupied. Clearly Area A is not, because Israel is not the government, and Israel can't even do anything it wants to in these territories. Some people try to say, oh well, they're controlling the borders, they're controlling what can go in and out. Therefore, that's virtually control of the whole territory. That's complete fiction. There's no legal basis for saying that whatsoever. They just make it up. They're saying, we know Israel must be evil, therefore we have to come up with a way of saying that Israel's still like, it's just not there. And I've seen, both the UN and Amnesty International really twist themselves into pretzels, try to explain why Gaza is occupied. And it makes no sense. It was a very funny argument. Amnesty was a riot, but because they knew they were making no sense. The UN somebody asked this question, and the UN said, we'll get back to you. And about a week later, they did get back to them, and they said, we consider all of the territories to be one entity, and therefore, since we call the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank, and Gaza is also a Palestinian territory, therefore it has the name of occupied Palestinian territory, but so therefore it's our name for it, which implies that they're also admitting it's not really occupied, but again, it's absurd. 11b, the settlements are illegal. This, again, the same arguments I gave before really apply to the settlements in general. The problem is, and this is a big problem, Israel has not done a good job fighting against this idea. Israel's just been quietly, working, and allowing people to move there. But this is now, even though you can argue against it, and we have the arguments I gave, apply to the settlements, but it would be like, going to somebody right now and saying, well, the Civil War really had nothing to do with slavery. No, maybe you could find arguments for it. Maybe you could find historic basis for that thing. Nobody's going to believe you, because this is now fact in the minds of 99% of the world. This is a very, very difficult thing to fight against. Even though, you could go into legalisms, you could just talk about all the stuff I said, you're not going to convince people because they grew up with it. They, their mother's milk came with the idea of illegal settlements. This is the biggest problem Israel has, in my opinion, right now, is that they didn't really fight it, and it's probably too late to fight it right now. The idea of illegal settlements. The best thing that I could say, but it's not much, is last year Israel came out with the Levy report, the government commissioned, to come up with, a legal definition of what the settlements are like. And the Levy report came out saying they're allowed. There's nothing wrong with it. I could not find a serious argument, from a legal perspective. I didn't find anybody that really did a good job of ripping apart the Levy report on the basis of international law. So that's something you could tell people. You could say, listen, find me an argument against it that actually tells me why their arguments about San Remo, et cetera, are wrong. Why 242 clearly is allowing Israel to hold on to some territory. Obviously, it has to be negotiated, but Israel clearly could hold on to some territory on the other side of the Green Line, according to 242. And and they went through all the arguments, and I've never seen anybody really destroy this argument or even do a good job. I saw one person try, but they were just bringing UN resolutions. The UN resolutions generally didn't have any international legal validity either. But nevertheless, this is the hardest thing because it's going to be very hard for you to convince people to say, oh, they're really not illegal. It's just, it's just in all the newspapers. It's the way it is. It is a very, very, it's Israel's biggest problem right now. If you look at Europe, the way they talk to Israel, they're saying, hey, we like you, we want you, but what are you doing with the settlements? The settlements are what's destroying everything. Your settlements, you have no, and Israel never answers. Israel just says, well, we're going to build them anyway. Too bad. And it just doesn't look good. Israel has not, in the Levy report, they just say, Levy report, please. We don't believe that. But it's a real big problem, and Israel has missed the boat for the past 45 years. However, but as I said, there are answers for that. And I said, like I mentioned before, the Levy report is an answer, 242, all the stuff I just mentioned to you over here. And another point I put on the bottom is that, so the other point is that, they said, that the reason that they're saying that, and I didn't mention this, but the reason that they're saying that the settlements are illegal is because they're saying it's a violation of Geneva, which says you're not allowed to transfer people from your own territory into the occupied territory. And again, like I'm saying here, legal scholars are saying that is really meant to stop the practice that the Nazis did and that the Russians were doing of essentially forcibly moving their own people into these other territories. It doesn't apply to voluntary transfer. However, and the other thing is that even if, not that it's much of an argument, even if you would say that you would admit that they're illegal, that does not mean that there's a legal right to uproot them. That's a whole different thing. We have hundreds of thousands of people that grew up and that live there, and there's no international law that says, oh, you must rip these towns down and these people must move. There's no such thing in international law. But the legal answers are boring, like what I'm saying. Everybody already fell asleep. So, what else can you do? You have to go on the offensive. We have emotional arguments. The Arabs right now have cornered the market on emotional arguments. They're the ones that have, the movies with the crying kids and the crying mothers and the, pictures of the dead people and this and that. And then to talk about their land and the olive trees and the olive trees and the olive trees and the olive trees. Jews never had olive trees. Only there. If you look, I did this once. I did a search in Reuters pictures of olive trees. Just a search in the news media of olive trees. The only people in the world with olive trees are Palestinians. Spanish don't have olive trees, Greeks don't have olive trees, the Italians, only the Palestinians. Every single news picture was a picture of Palestinian Arabs with olive trees. But that's, so that's, the fact is, this is the land of our forefathers. You know, people say they get bored with the argument. The fact is, when you really believe it, you say, you know, sorry, this is our land. This is where Jewish history started. We've been crying, we've been davening, we've been praying, we've been doing everything in order to bring back, you know, to get back to this land. We don't want to repeat. We remember what happened in 1948 when we lost the old city of Jerusalem and when we lost Har Hazeisim. We saw what Jordan took, you know, taking the gravestones from the Mount of Olives and using them as paving bricks and to build latrines. We saw them destroy 50 synagogues in Old Jerusalem. We saw them rip. I mean, we saw all of this happen. We don't want this to happen again. This is our people. 2 of my grandparents are buried on Har Hazeisim. I want to be able to visit them. Now, it's true. What I'm saying is 100% true. But the fact is, we need to say that to people, because how are they going to argue against it? They're going to, oh, there's going to be an agreement that you can? Okay, what's the agreement going to be like? Let's look at where right now is there an agreement that Israelis can go and visit a holy place that's under Arab control. We have an example. Nablus, visiting the Kever Yosef. So yes, Jews can visit once a month, can visit the Kever Yosef. What are the conditions? They go in armored buses. They go in the middle of the night. They go with a huge Israeli army contingent. The Palestinians always are throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails at the army anyway. In between that month, which happened last month, the Palestinians are actually, they throw urine in the Kever Yosef and they throw graffiti and they try to burn it down and stuff like that. This is the best we can imagine is going to happen, is our access to the holy places if we lose that. And that is an important argument. We're not making that argument because it's an emotional argument and Jews are too logical. We're not talking emotions. We're just talking, we can argue legal, this and that. No, this is the real argument. Nobody, and the liberals don't know how to answer something like this because it's emotional. They can't answer it with the Arabs. They can't answer it with us. We're not using this argument. And it's a very important saying. This is a Twitter-type soundbite. Jewish human rights are no less important than Palestinian Arab human rights. Yeah, fine. They have human rights. We're not denying that. We have human rights too. Don't say that we don't. Don't rip them away because you think the other ones are more important. Security is also an important argument. The emotional arguments, I think, are the most important. The religious emotional arguments, and we've been ceding that completely, and we really have to stop doing that. Security arguments are important also. Again, Ben Gurion Airport will be in range of shoulder-mounted anti-aircraft guns. This is insane to even think that we could have, a few miles away from Ben Gurion Airport, anybody, not just, we don't have to worry about the government agency. We can worry about anybody from Hamas, Islamic Jihad, anybody who manages to smuggle, a shoulder-mounted rocket can start shooting at our planes. The answer isn't, we can put, flares on the planes in order to, that's not an answer. That's not the way to do things. There is a security argument. 9-mile-wide state is indefensible. It's no good. People say, no, Israel is nukes. You don't have to worry about it. How do nukes help you? You're going to bomb, Nablus? You're going to kill yourself. It doesn't make sense. Withdrawing from Gaza didn't bring peace. Everybody says, if you just did one more thing, withdraw, it'll bring peace. What happened with Gaza? We withdrew from Gaza. We withdrew from southern Lebanon. It didn't happen. We should start learning lessons from what happened in the past. Remember who won the last elections in the PA? It was Hamas that won. If they would have true, honest elections again, Hamas would win again. And sometimes the status quo is the lesser of all evils. People say, and you'll see the statement all the time. People will be saying, we can't keep things as they are right now. There's never going to be a better time for us to have a peace treaty, this and that. You know what? The status quo is pretty good right now. The Shin Bet just came out with the statistics saying that for the first time ever, there were 0 people killed from attacks that originated in the West Bank in 2012. Never happened before. If you compare the terror attacks and the number of people killed, because people were killed last year, obviously, but if you compare the number that were killed now versus the number that were killed during the Oslo process, before the Intifada, people forget about this. The Intifada started in 2001. Between 1993 and 2001, there were still suicide bombings. That every few months there were a few, and some major ones. There were still terror attacks. The press, swept it under the rug, saying, we're in the middle of a peace process. When peace happens, then everything will be fine. But things were worse during the peace process than they are right now when things are so supposedly horrendous. No Israelis were killed from attacks within the West Bank, is my understanding, and Jerusalem. Okay. Obviously, there was from Gaza, there were rockets, and that was it, is my understanding. I have to look it up specifically, but I'm pretty sure that was it. But nobody was killed. that was just injured. Nobody was killed in the bus. Yeah. Okay. This is worthwhile. Again, I'll end up putting this online, but I'm not going to read all of these things. But United States, presidents, secretaries of state have been very consistent up until Obama, have been very consistent in saying that the 67 borders are not realistic. So again, I'm not going to read them all, but they're very explicit about it. I mean, if you ask Obama says swaps, so you could argue, okay, the swaps are, but nevertheless, he was the first one to really formulate saying based on the 67 lines. The previous presidents were very careful not to say that. And in fact, they said the opposite. They said it's just not going to happen. We know there's going to be border adjustments. Number 12, the idea of a Jewish state is inherently racist. This is a very seductive argument. Usually there'll be very self-righteous talk saying human rights, equality. If you have a Jewish state, it's impossible to keep the concept of a Jewish state together with the concept of a pure democracy. The answer is, yeah, there's a tension there. There's no doubt. It's true. You can't have 100%. If you're calling something a Jewish state, it's not going to be, it means there are going to be slight things, the law of return is going to be there, it's going to be more for Jews. There are going to be some things that are going to be slightly better for Jews, for 100% true. But there's a reason. This is the only Jewish state. There's a reason that the Jewish state was created. It's the only place that Jews who are being persecuted can go without fear. There's Jews, and then we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but the Jews aren't just a religion, it's a nation. And this is, again, self-determination. This is national self-determination. There are lots of Arab countries. There's only one Jewish country. And given that, Israel does safeguard the rights of the Arabs as much as humanly possible, and far more rights than in any Arab country. And you can't claim that Israel's racist when Israeli Arabs have been on the Supreme Court, and even the acting president for about a month was once an Arab. Not to mention the number of Arabs that win reality TV shows. I mean, again, if Israelis were racist, they would not be voting for these people. So, but this is just an example of the hypocrisy of the accusers, because if you look at the constitutions, and I've done this also, if you look at every single Arab state constitution, everyone defines themselves as this is an Arab state, meaning that we are going to give priority to Arabs over non-Arabs. Practically all of them, the exception being Lebanon and I believe Syria, say we are basing also, Islam is the religion of the state, or even more so, they'll say our legal system is based on Islamic Sharia law. They say this explicitly. I've never seen anybody that complain about the idea of a Jewish state say anything bad about the fact that these Arab states are much, much more guilty of the same crime, supposedly. So the fact is the accusers measure Israel against an idealized, perfect, and impossible standard, but nobody else has that thing. So that's those typical double standards that you're going to be seeing about Israel. So the fact that they don't care about human rights, they just want to bash Israel, and they use human rights as a weapon. They're also silent in the anti-Palestinian discrimination. I mentioned, like in Lebanon, Palestinian Arabs are not allowed to own land. And many, many jobs they're not even allowed to have. They're not even allowed to expand the camps that they're in. They're just getting more and more crowded. Especially now for a lot of the Syrians the Syrians that are coming in that are of Palestinian ancestry are going to these camps as well. It's intolerable. But Lebanon will not let them build. As I said, every Arab country except Jordan will not let them have citizenship. Syria slaughtered over 800 Palestinian Arabs so far in the current war. Nobody seems to care. And in Iraq, and when the Iraqi war happened, Saddam Hussein was very pro-Palestinian. So the Iraqi people turned against the Palestinians en masse after he was deposed. They were treated awfully. A number of them ran away. They were true refugees. No Arab country would take them in. They were stuck in these tents right in the border between Iraq and Syria. They were stuck. There were hundreds of them. They were stuck there. No Arab country would allow them to take them in. The UNHCR was taking care of them because UNRWA doesn't have jurisdiction over that. So the UNHCR was actually saying, doing their job, trying to come up with ways of resettling them. I saw an amazing editorial in an Arabic newspaper, Palestine. It was just so perfect, in which UNHCR found a few places that could take them. Canada, Iceland, somewhere in South America, a few countries were allowing, to take some of these Palestinian Arabs in. And this person wrote an editorial against it, saying, how dare they, by them taking them in, they're going to become citizens of these Western countries, they're going to lose their Palestinian character. It's just amazing. They want to use them as pawns, and this guy was saying explicitly, we got to keep them in misery. That's what we do. A couple days ago, somebody challenged me for something, so I just coming up, we were talking about something like this, and somebody said, well, how do you put that into a tweet? It's like, okay, let me try. Hypocrites who attack only Israel in the name of human rights are the same who deny only the rights of Jewish people to self-determination. That's less than 140 characters. Using human rights as a weapon against only Israel while tacitly condoning abuses by Arabs makes one a hypocrite, not a humanitarian. And the major purveyors of Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism today are the ones Israel is expected to make concessions to for peace. So it's possible to come up with some fairly good tweets if you have to. Number 13, Jews are not a nation. Especially after Shlomo Sand came up with his book called The Invention of the Jewish People. People like to say, and the Muslims especially say this, they'll say, Judaism is only a religion, it's not they're not a nation. What's the answer? The answer is very simple. Mi ka'amcha Yisrael go yachad ba'aretz. You're not going to get too much older than that as far as defining the Jews as a nation. The world also, if you look at newspapers from the 1800s, you'll see that they'll talk about the Hebrew nation, they'll talk about the Israelites. I mean, a lot of the Jewish newspapers in America would be called the Israelite or something like that. It was obvious to everybody that the Jews were a nation. And they certainly are more of a nation than Palestinians are. Number 14, the Palestinians accept a two-state solution. They're saying, what's the problem? Israel accepts a two-state solution, Palestinians accept a two-state solution. What's the issue? The issue is this, in the top line over here, the top bullet. Israel wants the two-state solution to be two states for two peoples. And the U.S. has said this as well. Two states for two peoples. The PLO and the Palestinians, the Arabs, have always been completely against that formulation. 100% against it. 2010 poll, 90.7% of Palestinians said it's essential to have Palestine from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. Salam Fayyad, the most moderate leader or pseudo-leader that the Palestinian Arabs ever had, insisted that you cannot say the words two states for two peoples in a joint press release. The Palestine Papers, there was a huge argument between Tzipi Livni and the Arab negotiators, because Tzipi was trying to say, you got to say two states for two peoples, and they just were saying, absolutely not. It was complete, no way. Nabal Sha'ath, another moderate, said Palestine would be a state for one people, but we're never going to accept that Israel's a state for one people. So he even said, we're never going to allow Jews to be in Palestine, but you have to do, it's insane. And of course, nobody's saying, and of course they'll also claim, Israel's planning on kicking out all the Arabs. If they say it's, two states for two peoples, then Israel, the next step is Israel's going to kick out the Arabs, which is absurd. And the same poll, this in 2011, was done by the Israel Project, 68% of Palestinians, because they went beyond the question of, do you support a two-state solution? Everybody asked, do you support a two-state solution? And a lot of them will say yes. More than half will say yes. But the same poll said, tell me if this is true. Do you say the real goal is to start with two states and then to move to one single Palestinian state destroying Israel? 68% agreed with that statement. Usually the pollsters don't ask that question. This is the only time a pollster asks that question. That is what really happens. And this drives the Israeli left crazy because they want to be able to say, yes, there's peace and peace, peace. But when you look at the statistics, there's nothing to give you optimism. Number 15, Israel's turning more hawkish. Even before the elections last week, this was a popular thing. Everybody says, Israel, the most right-wing government ever. In 1988, Israel would never, nobody in Israel, except for the tiny Peace Now group that was there, would ever consider talking to the PLO. 93, they had a peace treaty with the PLO. They still refused to accept the Palestinian state. Rabin, everybody now says, Rabin, he was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, he was a leftist. If he was still around, we would have peace nowadays. Rabin was dead set against the Palestinian state. And he said this only a month before he was killed. He said, we want to have this an entity that's less than a state, and that it'll have autonomy, but we're going to have United Jerusalem, we're going to have Amalei Adumim, all the E1 thing that everybody's talking about. It was freaking out a few weeks ago. Rabin said 100%, no, we're keeping that. That's not even a question. Jerusalem, although the expanded Jerusalem, including Amalei Adumim, is going to be a capital of Israel under pure Israeli sovereignty. And it says also we're going to include the Jordan Valley in our border. He said stuff that the most right-wing right now people say, and everybody says, it's so right. This is Yitzhak Rabin. In 2001, of course, Israel offered a Palestinian state over 90% of the West Bank. 2004, Israel abandoned Gaza. And today, if you look at the position of Netanyahu, the rightist, hawkish, whatever they want to call him, his formula, his official formula of accepting a two-state solution is to the left of what Rabin's was. It's not far off what Peace Now was in 1989. And he's the crazy rightist. But if we look at the other side, Abbas is a moderate. There's going to be a lot of this. There's about 7 slides. He bragged in 2011 that the Palestinian leadership has not moved their position one bit since 1988. I just described how Israel moved since 1988, far to the left. He brags that nothing has changed from their position since Arafat in 1988. No public movement of right of return, Jerusalem refugees, water, everything's the same. He used to say we could have peace talks with Israel while settlements were building. He created an entirely new position in 2009, really to punish Netanyahu, saying we're going to stop negotiations as long as there are settlements. That was a new thing. George Mitchell was arguing with him, saying, what are you doing? You know, this is your position the whole time. We need to get you back to the negotiating table. And Arabas said, absolutely not. He went to the right. He's an extremist and a liar. He's negotiating to include both, Hamas and Islamic Jihad as part of the PLO. He just accused the Zionists of the 1930s of complicity with the Nazis in the Holocaust. He himself is a Holocaust denier. He claims his family was expelled from Sfat in 1948, but in Arabic he admitted that they fled before any Jewish troops arrived. He told the Western media he's against naming public squares after terrorists, but in Arabic he said he definitely has done it, and he's on film doing it, especially against Dalal Mughrabi, who was responsible for the Coastal Road massacre. He praised the terrorist mastermind behind the Munich Olympics, and he in fact bankrolled the operation in 1972, though it's not clear that he knew exactly what it was for, but he was the bankroller behind it. More, he claims that the Israeli demand for calling it a Jewish state was a new demand by Netanyahu, but no, Olmert, the left-winger, had demanded it in 2007. The PLO refuses to accept the existence of the Jewish people. They said we cannot accept the Jewish people because, and they said in the Palestine Papers, recognizing the Jewish state implies recognition of a Jewish people. If we do that, it may lend credence to Jewish people's claim to all of historic Palestine. We are never going to accept that the Jewish people even exist. He told the Arab League that Israel was ethnically cleansing Arabs from Jerusalem. He's actually said that many times. There's there's the graph of how the Arab population in Jerusalem has been doing since '67, which is hardly ethnically cleansing. More. He said Jews were never expelled from Egypt. Okay, there's a good lie. He said Israel's changing the character of Jerusalem by allowing the Hurva synagogue to be built higher than the Dome of the Rock. That's not an exact quote, but that was what he was saying. He says archaeologists found no evidence for Jewish temples. Again, he goes on and on. He says that Zionists, the old libel that Zionists were the ones that bombed the Iraqi Jews to scare them into emigrate to Israel. He said the Zionists started expelling Arabs immediately after the 47 partition vote. It's actually the first people that became refugees after the 47 vote were the Jews, believe it or not, in Jaffa. He praised many times the anti-Semitic Mufti of Jerusalem, who was a collaborator with Hitler. And I'm not done. He said in September 2011 that Obama promised him a full state within a year, but Obama never said that. He's just a complete inveterate liar. He's an extremist, but everybody calls him a moderate. He said Hamas approved of a two-state solution. I mean, just complete garbage. But people still believe him. I do this constantly, over and over again. Yes?
Maybe just a moderate relative to...
That's the next slide. So, here's I once made a poster about him. So, the rejectionist. Okay. So, but next to suicide bombers, he's a moderate. And Netanyahu is hawkish next to Haaretz. So that's how the words work over here. And people use them without context. And of course that's what they mean, but this is not a joke. This is literally what it means. When they say Arabas is a moderate, they're saying compared to everybody else. When they say themselves, but words have no meaning if they have two meanings. You can't do this. And this is the way the media does things nowadays. Number 17, Israel's an apartheid state. Or Israel is not a democracy because it doesn't allow non-citizen Palestinian Arabs to vote. I saw this last week. It was ridiculous. Rather than try to, it's ridiculous to even answer this because you just can't say it in words. So I once made a series of posters, just saying, hey, here's a guy who was this guy on the left, he's an Arab, but he led a 3-judge panel that convicted a former president of Israel, of crimes. The guy in the middle, Jamal Zakalda, he claims that he's a victim of Israeli racist apartheid, but he happens to be the head of a Knesset party. The guy on the right, he was the acting president of Israel. He's a Druze. Beyond that, I once made this cartoon on the left saying, showing thousands of African refugees risk their lives to go to Israel. So I guess nobody told them Israel was an apartheid state. There's a great quote by William Safire over there. First time in history, thousands of black people are being brought into a country not in chains but as citizens, which is true. When else have people actively tried to bring black people into their country? Only once, only Israel. And then this is a picture somebody once sent me. This is in the Rami Levy supermarket. I don't know where in the West Bank it was, but they're just shopping together. They're smiling. This is what the reality is. But people don't see it. It's not apartheid. Who really practices apartheid? Every Arab state, we already talked about, discriminates against Palestinians. Jews are being, were ethnically cleansed out of Egypt and the other countries. The Egyptian Copts are fleeing like crazy, over 100,000 left. Christians throughout the Middle East are being forced out. And the Palestine, if it ever, chas v'shalom, comes to exist, is going to be Judenrein. Number 18, Israel targets civilians. Goldstone was really bad with this, but Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, they say this all the time. Or sometimes they'll say, Israel's aim is so good that no civilians should ever be killed. It's one of the two. They don't quite fit together, but they'll try. Again, if Israel's targeting civilians, they're doing a very poor job. About half of those killed in Cast Lead were civilian, which is incredibly low for an urban war. That's just never happened in history. Usually, especially like in Iraq, I think it's like 80% civilians were killed by the Americans. By the good guys, Americans, NATO. It's just nobody does a better job than Israel does. Although I'm very interested in how the French are doing in Mali, but right now Mali's a little bit different because there aren't that many civilians around where Al Qaeda is. I had an entire team counting the martyrs of Cast Lead. We were going through Arabic sites, going through Hamas things, going to look where, their obituaries. So while, people were saying that none of them were, all these people were civilians, we were looking up and seeing pictures of them with their uniforms and how they were being called shaheeds, et cetera, et cetera. Some of those supposedly killed by Israel in Pillar of Defense were actually killed by Hamas rockets that fell short. And some civilians, and again, they're still civilians, but some of them were killed when they're hanging out with the terrorists. Whether it's a younger brother or whether it's a friend or something like that. So yeah, they're civilians, but it's a little hard to target the terrorists when they're right next to the civilians like that. The problem is the IDF is better than it used to be, but getting this information out it's very often comes out too late. So it's very hard to be able to counter these arguments in real time. Oh yeah, okay, you can take pictures of them, not me. In fact, I wanted to do that before too. Okay. A variant of this, Israel targets Christians. This happens around Christmas. You'll always see them say, Bethlehem used to have a majority of Christians. Now it's very small. It's because of the wall. It's because of the separation fence. Israel is forcing them out. I didn't know that the wall could discriminate between Christians and Muslims. Bethlehem has more Muslims now than it ever did. So I don't quite understand how it managed to only target the Christians. The fact is, this is a consistent pattern. It's not only in the West Bank. Christians are moving out of the Middle East in droves. There's a common denominator there. What's the common denominator? It's Islam. But and in fact, I found this also in 1967. Right after Israel won the West Bank, the Abbasist party, Fatah, threatened Christian tourists because they didn't want them to come. So they said, if you come, we're not going to be, you guys are going to be in danger. And Israel had to, of course, defend them. And now they're claiming that it's Israel that threatens Christians, but they did it explicitly. Number 19, contiguity or Jerusalem is necessary for a Palestinian state to be viable. It can't happen if it's non-contiguous. It can't happen without Jerusalem. We'll talk about Jerusalem first. Why? It's a very simple question. Why? Why is Jerusalem necessary for a Palestinian state? Keep in mind that the Zionists accepted a partition plan in 1947 without Jerusalem. Jerusalem was going to be an international city. There's their heart and soul, and they said, you know what? It's too important that we have that we have a state that we can save the Jews for, that we have a place for them to go safely. Even though we're not happy with this at all, we'll accept it without Jerusalem. Insisting that Jerusalem is a necessity is not the same as it being a necessity. Just because they say it over and over again doesn't make it true. There's nothing inherent that stops Ramallah from being the capital of a Palestinian state. And in fact, I found this out relatively recently too, British officials in 1921, when they were coming up with the border lines for the mandate, they were saying, well, these are the major cities that must be Arab. And they said, Hama and Aleppo and Damascus and a few other things, but they didn't include Jerusalem, purposefully. And Churchill asked Sir Henry McMahon, why not Jerusalem? He said, oh, they're not interested in Jerusalem. We've never heard them say anything about Jerusalem. Jerusalem's not important to them. And of course, from 1949 to 1967, Jordan owned Jerusalem, or the eastern part of it, and they did nothing. It was a slum. Whoops, back previous. So compare. Chaim Weizmann famously said the Jews would accept a state the size of a tablecloth, because the purpose of the Jewish state is to save the Jews. The purpose is to have a safe place for them to be. When your priority is the safety of your people, statehood is the most important thing, not the borders. The existence of a state gives you protection, gives your people protection. But when your priority isn't the building of one state, but the destruction of another, What do? You try to cut out the heart of the other. And similarly, when you listen to how the PA talks about Syrian Palestinians and Lebanese Palestinians, their welfare is less important than the right of return. They're saying, no, we don't want them to come to us. We want them to have the right of return to go to Israel. We don't want them in our, we have autonomy. Yeah, we can take, there's nothing stopping people from going to Gaza and moving there right now. In fact, during '67, there's a refugee camp that's in Jordan called the Gaza camp. What happened? Why is there a Gaza camp there? In '67, after Israel won, the Arabs weren't kicked out. There was nothing weird that happened with them. It was too fast. They didn't see any troops. But a lot of them decided they really didn't want to live under Jewish rule. A lot of Gazans felt, we don't want to live under Jewish rule. We were much more comfortable living under, having Arabs rule over us. So Israel said, fine, you're free to go to the West Bank. We're all one big country right now. You can, here's a bus. You can go wherever you want. They went to the West Bank, and then they crossed over the Allenby Bridge to Jordan. Tons of Gazans did this. Thousands of Gazans, not 1,000, 10,000, 20,000. I don't remember the exact number. And Jordan took them in. Jordan didn't give them citizenship, because Jordan only gave citizenship to West Bankers, not to Gazans. And they're in a camp. And their descendants are now in this camp in Jordan it's actually called Jerash, but it's known as the Gaza camp. Now, Gaza is controlled by Hamas. There's nothing, absolutely nothing, as far as I could tell, that would stop them from going through Egypt into Gaza and going back to where they used to live. I don't see any law, nothing like that. People say, Egypt enforces Israeli, rules as far as who's a citizen, but Egypt doesn't have to do that. There's no reason for them to do that. They can go right now to move to Gaza, but nobody wants them to. Isn't it their homeland? This is where they're from, but they're being prevented from it. And I even saw an interview where they're saying, after Hamas took over and after Israel withdrew before Hamas took over, after Israel withdrew in 2004, they were saying, yeah, we really are anxious to go back. Hopefully we'll be able to go back now. But nobody's let them go back. It's not in Israeli hands to stop them. The Arabs are stopping them. As far as contiguity is concerned, I made this poster about a week ago, called the Bantustans of New York, saying how New York is not a viable city. It's impossible. It just can't happen. Look, everything, bridges and tunnels between places. It's just no way it can happen. It's hemmed in on all sides. Here's a whole airport over here that they can't build. It's Manhattan's one of the most densely populated things on Earth. Family members are separated by bridges and tunnels. Sometimes you have to take a ferry, a dangerous ferry, to go to work. It's just it goes on and on. I just wanted to, and people really like this. It was because it's what does contiguity mean? Why can't you have a highway from one section to another? What makes it so terrible? Is the United States not viable because Alaska and Hawaii aren't connected? It just doesn't make sense. But this is the logic. It has to be a contiguous state. If Israel has Mala Adumim, it dooms it. It's impossible. Tell me why. Nobody can explain why, but they say it as it's a fact. They repeat it over and over again, and people believe it. Because people are stupid. Okay. Argument number 20. Number 20. This is an argument, I'm sort of segueing a little bit, but this is more of an argument not so much by the anti-Israel crowd, so much, or parts of it are really done by the liberals that really believe that they like Israel. They say Israel would not be is not a democracy today, or if Israel holds on to the territories, the Jews will soon be practicing apartheid. People like Jeffrey Goldberg, who you cannot say is anti-Semitic, you can't say he's anti-Israel, but he's going to say this sort of thing, and he does say this thing often. Or I've seen people say, Israel's not a democracy because Palestinian Arabs who are living under their control couldn't vote in the January elections. Non-citizens can't vote in any country. I'm not quite sure what the point is over there. They can vote in their own elections. I'm not quite sure why you're expecting them to vote in Israeli elections. Should the settlers be allowed to vote in the Palestinian elections? I've never heard anybody say that. Gaza is clearly not under Israeli control, and as I said, neither is Area A. B is, you can make an argument either way. But the 95% of Palestinian Arabs that live outside of Israeli control, or live outside of Israeli control in their own government, which means if there's even a tiny Palestinian state that's generated only in Area A, the demographic argument disappears. You don't have to worry about Israel having a majority Arab population. Already Gaza, they're not there. That's not part of it. Israel doesn't want to control them, but the Palestinians demand all or nothing, and the world believes them, which is what actually keeps peace far away. Going further on, and again, this is more of the leftist argument than the Arab arguments, but people say, if Israel would just do X for peace, then Y would happen. If they would just do this, then peace will come back. If Israel withdraws the 67 lines, then there'll be peace. Palestinians would get no support for breaking the agreement. I found a really great quote in 1988 from Time magazine. They said, if Israel puts forth a detailed plan for peace and the Palestinians reject the offer, reasonable people that can identify as forthcoming and courageous, as they have rejected every attempt in the past, then no one could fault Israel for them saying, okay, we give up. That was in 1988. Since then, 2001, Israel did exactly that. 2007 or 8, Israel did exactly that. Does anybody say, oh, now we understand your point, Israel? You're right, you don't have to try anymore. We see it's the other side. It doesn't happen. It's the if-then. They say, if this happens, then for sure that's going to happen. It never does. It didn't work in Gaza. They say, oh, Israel gives up. Israel even said, we're going to give up Gaza. There's no reason for them to ever shoot rockets at us because we gave them everything they wanted. But the rockets kept coming. You're saying if this happens, then that's going to happen, but the then doesn't happen. And there's no evidence it would work today either. And just a final point again that's important to understand. I can go on and on, but we've gone on long. Israel consistently tries to come up with win-win formulas that help everybody. It's just, again, consistent. And this is what Jews, it's not just Israel. Westerners think this way. Arabs consistently act and say that it's a zero-sum game. If Israel wins, we lose. Therefore, anything that looks like an Israeli win must be fought against. The two are completely opposed. Those two ways of thinking cannot work together. So compromise is really impossible. If you make the other side feel that they won, then they feel they're powerful, and then they don't have to need the peace agreement to begin with because they can win again. Hamas still claims that they won. You can argue, okay, win, not, but clearly they didn't win either of the Gaza war or pillar of defense. Hezbollah claimed they won in 2006, and everybody in the world believes, okay, because Israel didn't completely flatten them, they're saying they won. But they lost 1,000 fighters, they lost a ton of rockets. Yeah, they managed to regain them. I'm not saying that in some senses you might be able to say they won, but they're just claiming victory is the important thing. It's a psychological thing, saying, we have to win. And therefore they'll move the goalpost, they'll do whatever is necessary and make it to a win, a zero-sum game, but they do not want a win-win situation. The two ways of thinking are just really, really different from each other. And then finally, there's wishful thinking versus reality. A lot of Westerners really want to see peace. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it stops them from being able to see things clearly. They don't see the Arab abuses and incitement. They just completely explain away all of the stuff that shows the Arabs being anything but peaceful. And they're good, and whether it's Hamas, the amount of articles I've seen saying, well, Hamas is pragmatic, Hamas is willing to accept peace, Hamas is willing to accept a two-state solution. Hamas never said any of these things, but Hamas will say something that could be interpreted on a Thursday if you're drinking a lot, that maybe it means perhaps something is close to approaching what a blind person might think looks like a temporary piece of pragmatism. But it doesn't happen. And Hamas will turn around in Arabic and say, we didn't say anything like that. What are you talking about? And it just consistently, but people, they want the peace so badly that they will believe stuff that doesn't happen. And you need to have people clearly talking to them, here are the facts. I want peace too. It's not like we don't want peace, but you can't have peace based on lies. You can't have peace based on wishful thinking. And the wishful thinking is amazing. It's out there. And I see it just happens all the time. It's just crazy. Peace is great, but the détente that we have right now is about as good as we're going to get. So let's keep it. So, thank you for coming. Thank you.